Good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Shaima. So today we continue with what I stopped in yesterday's class. So I'd given you all in yesterday's class an introduction and a little view into the motor system or the descending pathways. So now today we'll be dealing with the corticospinal tracts. Now, the corticospinal tract, if you look at the supraspinal influences on the motor control, is basically mediated through the descending pathways. Now, the supraspinal centers controlling the motor activities are broadly divided into two categories. You have the motor cortex and the brain stem centers. Now, this motor cortex primarily influences the spinal motor neurons through the corticospinal tracts, and the brainstem motor nuclei influences the motor functions through the rubrospinal, reticulospinal, and the vestibulospinal tract. So, in the coming up classes, we will be actually doing all these tracts. We have the corticospinal tract, rubrospinal, reticulospinal, and the vestibulospinal tract. So, now if you look at the corticospinal tracts, they're basically divided into two groups. You have the lateral corticospinal tracts and the anterior corticospinal tract. Now, the lateral corticospinal tract, which is the most important descending pathway, it controls the skilled voluntary activities of a human being. Now, the anterior or the ventral corticospinal tract is involved in the control of posture. So you can see the picture here. This is the figure of the corticospinal tract, where you can see both the lateral corticospinal tract, which is seen as the green color tract fiber, and the anterior corticospinal tract, both is discussed in the same figure here. Now, when the question comes for exams, depending upon if they have asked corticospinal tract as such as a 10 marker, you'll have to draw it like this together, including both the lateral corticospinal tract fibers and the anterior corticospinal tract fibers. But if they have specifically asked only the lateral corticospinal tract or the anterior corticospinal tract, you need to draw it accordingly, pick it up and draw it. So, only the lateral corticospinal tract, draw only the green ones, right from where it originates from the motor cortex to where it terminates on the muscles, the distal and the proximal group of muscles. So, you can see that in the corticospinal tract, 80% of the fibers belong to the lateral corticospinal tract, and 20% of the fibers of the corticospinal tract constitutes the anterior corticospinal tract. So basically you can put it as these are two groups. There are two groups of corticospinal tract, the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tract. So I think I'll go to the origin of the tract. So once you draw the figure, and for an essay question, when you start explaining the figure, your first heading needs to be origin. I have actually put it up. The PPTs have been made in such a way that you can just follow the same way, put it exactly like that. Please don't go to condense from there, because whatever I have put is the most brief condensed form of how your university answer should be. So as I explained, you can keep looking at the figure so that you have a better understanding of the course of the corticospinal tract. Now if you look at the origin of the corticospinal tract, you can see that the fibers of the corticospinal tract mainly originate from the motor cortex area number 4, especially from the large motor cells of Betz, B-E-T-Z, which is in the fifth layer of the precentral gyrus. But that's not actually marked in the figure. In the figure it just put as motor cortex area number 4, but it will be good if you can specifically mention there you will see motor cells of Betz, B-E-T-Z, which is present in the fifth layer of the precentral gyrus. But please keep in mind that's not the only one point of origin of the corticospinal tract, because basically corticospinal tract contains more than 1 million axons. constitute the corticospinal tract. So the origin practically cannot be only from motor cortex area 4. So you need to understand there are other places of origin also for the corticospinal tract. Now the other cortical motor areas include, you have the premotor cortex, which is area number 6, supplementary motor area, which is medial part of area 6. You have the primary somatosensory cortex, which is area 3, 1 and 2. You have the parietal cortex, area number 5 and 6. Now the motor cortex contributes to around 60% of the fibers of the corticospinal tract. 30% of the fibers come from area number 4 and 30% from area number 6, which includes the premotor cortex. And the sensory cortex also makes a contribution here. It makes a contribution of around 40% fibers to the corticospinal tract. So that's about the origin of the corticospinal tract. Now let's see how the course of the tract is. Now the course of the tract, I'll be explaining origin. Till now what I told you was that orange color where you can see the green and the purple dots, which is the origin of the corticospinal tract. Now when I talk about course, it means that how the fibers are radiating down, the structures through which they traverses, whether they cross to the opposite side or they are ipsilateral, they remain on the same side, and finally till they terminate on the spinal cord. So when you explain the corticospinal tract or the descending pathways, it's going to be under 3 headings. First you have the origin, which I've already done. Now it will be the course, and finally we'll come to the termination. So let's see the course of a tract. So as I explain, I again repeat, please follow the diagram so that it's clear for you all. So now basically you know where the fibers originate, basically from motor area number 4 and 6. Now the fibers arising from different parts of the cortical areas, you can see that, can you see the blue color structure which is named as internal capsule? So that requires a little explanation there, and you can see that between the motor cortex and the internal capsule, it's mentioned as corona radiata. So how you explain that particular the radiating pattern is, the fibers arising from different parts of the cortical areas, they converge through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. You need to make it very specific there, that it's a posterior limb of the internal capsule, because of the other limbs of the internal capsule, there are other sets of fibers which are passing. Now as the fibers in the subcortical area, they basically appear in a radiating pattern. So that's why we call it as the corona radiata. Radiating pattern is, you can see the motor cortex, they are basically spread. They are spread, distributed properly, and as they needs to pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, they basically converge and come together, and there it forms a radiating pattern which we call as the corona radiata. So now after passing through the internal capsule, to be specific, the posterior limb of the internal capsule, the fibers descend down in the ventral brainstem as cerebral peduncles. Can you see the fibers? They become more thick and they are passing down, but as they pass down, you need to specifically tell exactly the position which they are occupying. So where the fibers, after passing through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, are coming down in the ventral brainstem as cerebral peduncles. Now in the medulla, can you see the pink color one, the pyramid? In the medulla, the fibers pass through, some of the fibers pass through the pyramid in the medulla and some of them do not. So now the 80% of the fibers, the cerebral peduncles, they pass through the pyramid of the medulla, which immediately they pass through the pyramid of the medulla, 80% of the fibers, and they immediately decussate to the opposite side, or they cross over to the opposite side, and then they descend down. Now you need to mention, as they descend down, which position they occupy. They descend down in the lateral funiculus of the spinal cord. Now this forms the lateral corticospinal tract. Now this lateral corticospinal tract fibers, they have monosynaptic connections with the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. They are down at the spinal cord, which you can see as a pink marking as the anterior horn cells. So basically the connections there is a monosynaptic connection. So that was about 80% of the fibers which was passing through the pyramid of the medulla, which immediately after passing through the pyramid of the medulla decussated to the opposite side. Now we have some more fibers remaining. The remaining 20% of the fibers descend down ipsilaterally, that means they are not crossing over to the opposite side, and they come down through the medulla. It's not passing through the pyramid, and they come down in the anterior funiculus of the spinal cord. Please remember, the lateral corticospinal tract, after they decussated to the opposite side, they were coming down in the lateral funiculus of the spinal cord. Now here the 20% of the fibers which constituted the anterior corticospinal tract without crossing to the opposite side comes down on the same side of the spinal cord, occupying which area? The anterior funiculus of the spinal cord. And those fibers, you call them as the anterior corticospinal tract, and the fibers cross over to the opposite side only at the spinal cord. So those 20% fibers will directly come down, occupying the anterior funiculus of the spinal cord, and they'll end at the same side of the spinal cord, the anterior horn cells, and you can see they are crossing over. Crossing over is happening, but the crossing over is happening at the level of the spinal cord. So we have finished with the origin, the second heading, the course. Now we come to the termination. What's happening at, you can see different circles there in different colors. You can see different interneurons there. So there we speak about the termination of the corticospinal tract. Now the fibers of, so first we'll go to the lateral corticospinal tract. The fibers of the lateral corticospinal tract, they terminate on the lateral group of motor neurons in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. You can see that in the picture. Now about 30% of the fibers terminate directly on the motor neurons, but there is a major 70% fibers which terminate on the anterior horn cells through interneurons. That's a very important point to be noted there. Now these motor neurons innervate the distal limb muscles. It's very clearly shown in the figure. So basically the 80% fibers of the lateral corticospinal tract, which ends on the anterior horn cells, 30% ends directly on the anterior horn cells, 70% ends through interneurons, and from there the motor neurons which arises supplies the distal group of muscles, which takes care of the skilled movements. Now the fibers of the ventral corticospinal tract or the anterior corticospinal tract, which is occupying the anterior funiculus of the spinal cord, they terminate directly on the motor neurons, but they end on the interneurons on the same side of the spinal cord, and these interneurons would cross to the opposite side and they'll terminate on the medial group of motor neurons. Can you see that? It's marked in the figure there, the medial group of anterior horn cells. So the lateral corticospinal tract terminated on the lateral group of cells in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, but the anterior corticospinal tract or the ventral corticospinal tract fibers through the interneurons terminated on the medial group of anterior horn cells. Now the motor neurons arising from the medial group of anterior horn cells supplies the proximal group of muscles which takes care of the postural movements of the body. So I think that's about the tract. So you're going to put it under 3 headings. You need to draw the figure. You have to write the origin, the course, and the termination. So I think whatever I've explained, I've put it here. Now we need to see the functions of the corticospinal tract. Now, if you look at the functions, the motor cortex is mainly involved in the initiation, planning, and control of movements. Now, the corticospinal tracts transmit the command from the central, that's from the motor cortex, to the spinal cord. Exactly, which part of the spinal cord? The interneurons of the spinal cord, and also to the motor neurons. Now, the lateral corticospinal tract controls the skilled voluntary movements of the body, and the anterior corticospinal tract controls posture. So that's about the functions of both the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. Now next we come to what happens when there is a lesion at any level of the corticospinal tract. So basically when a lesion happens to I think we would discuss in two headings. When there is a lesion at the lateral corticospinal tract, so lateral corticospinal tract constitutes 80% of the fibers of the corticospinal tract, and the anterior or the ventral corticospinal tract constitutes 20% of the fibers of the corticospinal tract. So what happens when there is a cut at or a lesion in the lateral corticospinal tract comes on in this particular slide. After that we'll see what happens when a lesion occurs at the anterior or the ventral corticospinal tract. So when there is a lesion of the lateral corticospinal tract, so obviously there would be a defect with the skilled voluntary activities. It can be anything, painting, writing, anything. But what happens here is there is one more tract which you're going to study after this, which is called as a rubrospinal tract. So if the lateral corticospinal tract is damaged, but you have the rubrospinal tract intact in the body, so what happens is whatever deficit which is seen in the skilled voluntary activities of the person, you can see that all those deficits recover within few days or few weeks. So what happens in humans is an isolated, so this is theoretically this is what happens when there is a lesion of only the lateral corticospinal tract and you have the rubrospinal tract intact, then the impairment or the defect with voluntary movements will occur only for a short duration of time, few days to few weeks, because you have these same functions can be managed by the rubrospinal tract. But what happens is isolated lesions of the lateral corticospinal tract is very uncommon in human beings because of the close proximity of the two tracts. It's very difficult that whatever situation I've explained normally doesn't happen. Now in addition, one more reason is whichever diseases which affect the corticospinal tract will also affect the corticobulbar tract, which influences the activity of the extrapyramidal tracts. So a pure corticospinal tract disease or a lesion is basically not seen in human beings. So now let's see what happens when there is a lesion of the anterior corticospinal tract. Now the lesion of the anterior corticospinal tract in animals, basically in experimental animals in a lab setup when you try to create it, it results in inability to maintain posture when the animal is walking, climbing, etc. But in human beings what you see is a postural deficit which follows when there is a lesion of the anterior corticospinal tract is not very prominent because there are two reasons for it. First reason is the anterior corticospinal tract is not very well developed in human beings. And the second reason is human beings have got much better posture regulating pathways in the body other than this anterior corticospinal tract. For example, you have the reticulospinal tract and the vestibulospinal tract, which majorly maintains the posture in a human being. And when you have the reticulospinal tract and the vestibulospinal tract intact in a human being, the lesion of the anterior corticospinal tract alone is not going to produce a very prominent postural defect in the subject. So that's about the lesions. Now let's see what's the clinical importance of the corticospinal tract. That's a very important part of your essay. You need to end your essay question with this, the clinical importance. Now when you look at the clinical importance, the corticospinal pathway can get interrupted anywhere along its course from the cortex to the spinal cord, isn't it? That's what when we talked about the lesion. However, the lesion of the corticospinal tract at the level of the internal capsule, which you call it as a capsular lesion, is the commonest pyramidal tract lesion. Please keep in mind, you call it, when the lesion of the corticospinal tract occurs at the internal capsule, you call it as a capsular lesion, and that is actually the most commonest pyramidal tract lesion. Now what happens here is, fibers coming from different parts of the cortex, there are different areas where these fibers are originating, all of them converge and they pass through this posterior limb of the internal capsule, which is basically a very narrow tunnel. So all the fibers are passing through it. So basically any disease of the internal capsule will result in a complete interruption of the corticospinal fibers. And what does this lead to? It leads to contralateral hemiplegia, because 80% of the fibers of the lateral corticospinal tract, immediately after it passes through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, crosses over, or the better word would be, it decussates to the opposite side and it supplies the muscles of the opposite side. So what? A complete interruption of the corticospinal tract because of a capsular lesion will result in contralateral hemiplegia. Now there's something important to be noted here. The ascending fiber systems which arise from the basal ganglia cerebellum, they also pass very close to the internal capsule. So the extrapyramidal systems also get affected along with this corticospinal lesions. So what happens is, this pyramidal tract lesions or a disease due to this lesion at the internal capsule, we often call it as a complete upper motor neuron paralysis. Now a very common cause for the capsular lesion is a rupture of the Charcot's artery. The Charcot's artery is basically the lenticular-striate branch of the middle cerebral artery, and this is also called as the artery of cerebral hemorrhage, because the hemorrhage of this particular artery, the cerebral hemorrhage, as it accounts for more than 60% of the causes of the intracerebral hemorrhage. So that's basically about the clinical importance of the lesions of the internal or the corticospinal tract, or due to the or because of a capsular lesion. So I think there we wind up with the corticospinal tract, both the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract, under different headings like origin, course, termination, effect of lesion, and also the clinical importance. So I think we have few more tracks to be discussed, and I need to give you inputs on the upper motor neuron paralysis and the lower motor neuron paralysis, I think, which I'll be doing in tomorrow's class. So I'm just keeping on to the classes to a 25 minutes to 30 minutes class, so that uploading becomes a little easier for me. So I think you can be ready with whatever I have done today. So because if the corticospinal tract is really thorough for you all, the diagram with the explanation what I have given, whatever I am going to talk on upper motor neuron paralysis, lower motor neuron paralysis, and tracts like the rubrospinal tract, all those coming up descending pathway, understanding becomes very easy for you all. So please make your short notes. I think my PPT is more than enough. It completes your answer. So thanks for listening. See you all tomorrow. Thank you.